Hello, thank you for joining us on Washington Talk. I'm Connie Kim. The WHO declared that the coronavirus is officially a pandemic. The virus that was first detected in China quickly spread to South Korea, where its initial response measures had been controversial. How serious is the virus and how effectively has South Korea dealt with its containment efforts?
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
In the studio with me is Dr. Courtland Robinson, Associate Professor of the Department of International Health and core faculty member of the Center for Humanitarian Health at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Also joining me is Jean Lee, Director of the Korea Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Ms. Lee was the first Pyongyang bureau chief for the Associated Press. Welcome to the program.
Great to be here.
Welcome. Now, Dr. Robinson, I want to start off with you first. So the WHO has declared the coronavirus as a pandemic now. Help us understand what the implication of this is.
What they're saying basically is this is a global threat. We're all in this together, and the statements they're offering are doubling down on what they call a blended strategy of containment and mitigation, which means to test, detect, isolate, treat, but also carry out aggressive social distancing, avoiding crowds, canceling non-essential travel, not going to work, staying home as best you can. That we need to be aggressive in these approaches. We need to bring the curve down, the epidemic curve down, so we don't overwhelm hospital capacity for the people who really need things like ICUs and ventilation units.
So how did this virus spread so quickly in a short period of time across the world then?
It's it's easily spread. So breathing, talking, coughing, sneezing within 3 to 6 feet of somebody who's infected carries high risk of transmission. It also remains sort of viable on surfaces for at least several hours, maybe longer. So once it occurred and appeared in Wuhan, it began to spread rather quickly within Wuhan, and the Chinese government didn't take effective measures immediately, and then it began to move through China and across international borders, and now it's probably everywhere, but we just don't know exactly where and how many cases.
Mm-hmm. So the Chinese government has been criticized for its lack of taking active measures in the beginning of the outbreak of the virus. So what do you think China could have done differently?
I think for every government, there's a fine line between protecting its interests and being transparent. And of course, there are some governments that are much more concerned about creating a sense of panic or how it will reflect on their system and their messaging. China obviously could have been faster. We know the story of the doctor who raised the alarm in China. Unfortunately, he's since passed away. And that there were doctors who tried to raise that alarm, but then that some of them were silenced.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of initial responses by the government, South Korea is also raised as an example of how it could have taken a different initial measure when it comes to the outbreak. So there has been some criticism that it should have imposed a blanket travel ban on China in the beginning. So what is your take on this? Do you think they should have taken this measure?
South Korea, like other governments, was probably weighing its political relationships, economic relationship with China at the time. And I would suspect very reluctant to issue that kind of a blanket ban that could cause some tension in that very important relationship.
So you mentioned the political factor of South Korea's decision, but they did impose a travel entry ban from China's Hubei province later on as Japan and US imposed similar measures. So what is your take then? Wasn't it too late for that?
Aside from the global healthcare issue, each country is dealing with its political and economic relationships with the countries around them. Before we saw coronavirus, these countries were dealing with the rise in US-China competition, which is a separate, larger issue. And so every country, including South Korea, is trying to position itself within this broader geopolitical relationship.
So overall, how do you think South Korea has been dealing with this virus spread so far?
South Korea gets high marks, so generally speaking. So we look at Hong Kong, we look at Singapore, we look at South Korea. I would say that's a model for a lot of the rest of the world, this country included, to emulate. So there often is some bobbling at the beginning. What do we do? How do we contain it? Very soon we have to get into things like mitigation, which is it's here, it's in the country, we have to detect it, we have to treat it, we have to isolate it. So rolling out free testing, the drive-through testing, very innovative. We want to ideally contain it and control it, but when it's in the population, the main risk is community spread. And I think China and Singapore and South Korea in different ways. It's not all the same model. China is much more sort of top-down authoritarian. Democracies have to be, if you will, more responsive to the people's interests and wishes and desires. And I think those models, all of them, seem to be effective. And I hope we can look back at this and say, what are the lessons learned? What are things that countries did well? How do we replicate those? And even now, how can we try to replicate those models in other countries?
You know, I do have to say, South Korea is an interesting example because it is a very social country.
Yeah.
Those of us who've been there, we know how social people are. It's densely packed, as you can see how it would spread so quickly. But South Koreans are also very good at taking order to a certain degree. It's built into their culture in a certain way that isn't perhaps here in the United States.
President Trump banned entry from European countries, except for the UK. Are we expecting similar measures on South Korea right now? How do you assess this?
So, you know, recently I was watching to see, a couple weeks ago, I was watching to see if there would be that type of travel restriction on people who had been in South Korea, which would have made sense. However, I think the South Korean government was very active in lobbying against that because this is a very important relationship, the United States and South Korea, and they're looking at both the optics and also the negotiations that are underway on military cost sharing, and so they don't want anything that could make those negotiations and that relationship difficult. And I think that's perhaps why we saw the UK exempt. The UK-US relationship is also a very key relationship for Washington. But that may change. Certainly, we've heard President Trump hint that that may change with South Korea, that he may take more extreme measures. I do think that President Trump is trying to cast some blame on other countries for spreading the virus. I think it's misplaced. So we may see more tough restrictions and entry regulations as he scrambles to rescue himself in this situation.
So President Trump did say that he's going to monitor the situation in South Korea and China. So do you expect similar measures on South Korea? Or do you think the situation is dying down in South Korea?
It's very hard to say. I think the speech from the Oval Office was a little ambiguous on that point. Sort of, we may revisit some issues. I think he even mentioned South Korea. It may be that as they look at the decline in rates, slowing of spread, that they may say maybe lift some restrictions on movements from China, South Korea, maybe include UK and Ireland in the ban, because even senior ministers in the UK government are now positive. I just want to emphasize that viruses do not respect borders. Viruses do not respect politics. The response to viruses, sadly, can get political, and we have to be very cautious not to allow government relations favoring one nation over another to sort of color or focus, distract us from the main focus, which is how do we confront this global threat. I do take your point that at some point we get beyond this, and you don't want to so damage your relations arbitrarily with anybody and have to pick up the pieces, because that has consequences as well. And so after the ban, many European countries, I think, issued a protest saying this was done without consultation. It seems arbitrary. Why some countries, not all? So that caused a problem, if you will, a diplomatic problem. The public health perspective, was this a necessary measure in the interest of the public health of the planet, including the United States, but not only the United States? And travel bans generally work for a short period of time, but once you have spread, then you have to get into mitigation. This is not a foreign virus. This is a coronavirus, pure and simple. We have to deal with it. Every country has to deal with it. And the more we can cooperate and regulate things like travel, but other things like supply, distribution, and cooperation, the better we'll be as a whole.
So countries have gotten definitely political in terms of dealing with the virus outbreak. And we have to take a look at Japan and South Korea. So Japan imposed travel restrictions on South Korea, and South Korea has responded with a similar set of restrictions on their own. And a South Korean official has actually pointed out that Japan's actions were intended to have more intentions going further than quarantine measures. So how did you take this, Jean?
That's a largely political action. These two countries have had such long simmering disputes that go so far back historically, emotionally, politically, economically. And so that's an example, I would say, of the lack of strong relations between those two countries affecting their decisions on when it comes to a healthcare issue. And it's a shame. This is a time when countries should stand together and understand that they all share the threat that this poses, and not to be taking political pot shots at one another.
And South Korea also proposed assistance to North Korea in terms of helping prevent the coronavirus outbreak. Do you think South Korea is at a position where it can offer assistance to North Korea right now?
Yes, I do think that South Korea should, if any country should offer assistance to North Korea, it's South Korea, as well as China, because they are the neighboring nations. But I think with North Korea, it's a question of whether North Korea will accept it. And I do hope that they will. This is a moment where they should put political considerations aside and think about their people. North Korea is not very far from South Korea. They share a border. Likewise, China and North Korea share a border. And so we would like to see them rise above the political tensions and put their people first.
Do you agree with this view?
Absolutely. I think several recent commentators have suggested that maybe there is an opening here if North Korea chooses to take it, to reach out and say we want to cooperate, we need international aid, and to allow people to come in and help with the assessments, help support with testing, monitoring, all of the different strategies that we know how to roll out and do. And it's not to say North Korea doesn't know, but their health system is damaged, weakened by decades of I would say, neglect and misallocation of priorities and all the rest of it. But they can and should reach out, and the world should reach out to North Korea, and hopefully soon, because time is really of the essence. They can come to some agreement about what's needed and how to get those really life-saving supplies into the country and appropriately monitored, because that's something that goes with all humanitarian aid. It's not that North Korea is unique in that capacity. We need to monitor. Donors want to know where their contributions go, and we need to know because we have to ask, is it reaching the people who are most vulnerable? Those are important things, and those are going to have to be dealt with. They're sensitive, but time is of the essence here. We really don't have time to wait and see how the political issues will sort themselves out. We have a global pandemic, and North Korea is in the middle of it. They may not confirm any cases, but they're there. I'm pretty sure they're there, and they will be detecting them as those tests begin to roll out.
So we'll discuss the North Korea topic in our next discussion. Now let's watch a video for our next topic.
이 비누로 손 씻기를 자주 하고 공공장소에 갈 때에는 마스크를 착용하는 것을 습관화합니다.
There is a certain tension in the city and all over the country because people are aware of coronavirus.
North Korea claims it has 0 coronavirus confirmed patients in the country, but it has reached out to international organizations for assistance. The country has also acknowledged tremendous economic loss due to efforts to prevent the virus. How will the coronavirus impact North Korea that vowed to pursue a self-reliant economy? So, Ms. Lee, you were in North Korea for about 3 years as the North Korea bureau chief at AP. So when North Korea claims that they don't have any patients confirmed with coronavirus, how do you take their claim?
Semantically, it's probably accurate. Perhaps they don't have test kits, so they can claim that they don't have any confirmed cases. But I find it very hard to believe that coronavirus is not already in North Korea. There are so many people who go back and forth between China and North Korea every day, across the border on foot, as well as by train and also by plane. And so even though for the past month or so they had tried to stop most of those routes, I just find it hard to believe that it hasn't made its way.
Dr. Robinson, how do you see their claim?
I agree completely. It may be that they don't have confirmed cases. Tests, which I gather the Russians have now delivered. We don't know how many. Probably will go to Pyongyang first, but hopefully they'll get all over the country as needed. It's very likely, I think in all probability, it's there now, and tests will confirm that. The question is how many, where is it spread, how far is it spread? So we will know more as we go forward, but proximity to China, the porosity of the border, the transmissibility of this disease makes it highly unlikely that there's no cases in North Korea. I'm fairly certain that there are, but we need tests to confirm that.
Mm-hmm.
So I will tell you just on the ground what it looks like. I had to travel with my own soap because it was very hard to find something as basic as hand soap. And so in the United States, across South Korea, we've been talking about the importance of washing your hands. The North Koreans, all the North Koreans I met were meticulously clean, but they don't have things like hot water. And they don't have soap. And some very basic techniques that we are using to stop the spread, they don't have access to in most parts of North Korea.
I want to pick up on what Ms. Lee just said. So, Dr. Robinson, you were involved in assistance to North Korea at the China-North Korea border. Do you think that they have the capability to diagnose the coronavirus without the diagnostic kits?
I would say their diagnostic capacity is limited at best. I don't know exactly how many kits they have. So the health workforce and the health system is fundamentally impaired. It generally ranks fairly low on the global lists that WHO puts forward, and that's a problem. And you mentioned also the susceptibility. There's high levels of malnutrition. There's rises of infectious disease. Coverage for childhood illness is lower than it has been in previous decades. So all of these things make susceptibility higher with a impaired health system, limited supplies. All of these things raise many red flags about the ability of North Korea to respond quickly to do the treatment isolation or testing isolation and treatment that they need to do.
So, Ms. Lee, when you visited the hospitals and clinics in North Korea, what were the conditions like?
It's been more than 2 years since I've been to a North Korean hospital, but I've been visiting North Korean hospitals over the past decade. And so I imagine very little has changed since then. There are a few very well-funded hospitals in Pyongyang that do have adequate supplies, but for the most part, the hospitals and clinics that I visited did not have running water. So often you would have basins of water. They did not have hot water. They did not even have heat. The lucky ones had heat that they could use in the wintertime in the operating room. And so they didn't have sterilizing procedures or supplies. And so there's a whole gamut of in the lack of supplies in North Korea to stop the spread of a virus or infections in North Korea that we don't see. Right now, the problem is and the concern I have about the very strict rules that the North Koreans are taking on foreigners is that we don't have enough people on the ground to tell us what's happening. And that is perhaps by design on the North Korean part. They don't want prying eyes. That means that we rely on their propaganda, their state media, and the narrative they're telling is very different. I would ask Court whether, because we saw those images of them wearing masks, is that helpful at that point? Is that where their resources should lie?
Generally speaking, unless you have an N95, which is a much more sort of high-tech mask, it prevents maybe 95% of particulate matter to sort of penetrate The general sense is these cloth masks may help prevent spread because you're coughing into a mask as opposed to sneeze or coughing and sneezing, and it's disseminating droplets. It does not seem to have any particular effect to reduce risk of exposure. I think as a protective measure, limited utility at best. We need to start getting into the measures that we know work, which is things like social distancing, avoiding crowds, and doing that proper testing, isolation, treatment, cluster containment if you can to reduce spread of the illness. Those are the measures that we think will work. I think the wearing of masks by the general populace, probably not particularly effective. I don't think it does any harm unless people feel safer than they should be going into an environment where that mask will not really protect them.
In terms of a medical perspective, we are seeing items particularly centering around protective gear and diagnostic kits that are being exempt from sanctions. What other kind of medical appliances do you think we need to send into North Korea?
I think that the main issue is getting that frontline health workforce protected, personal protective equipment and the more effective protective masks and goggles and gloves, all of that. So when you're treating infected patients, you really have to have proper gear. That's the front line. The sort of second line is hand washing, soaps, hand sanitizers, messaging about social distancing. Beyond that, I think we can get into conversations about how well supplied are their ventilators, medical oxygen, and the like. I think that's a larger, more complicated discussion. I would focus first things first, roll out those immediate supplies and treatment, isolation, and testing, isolation, treatment, containment where you can, mitigation, and all the rest of the country.
Ms. Lee, I want to focus on the political aspect. So Germany has protested about its treatment of diplomats within North Korea, and which led to the closure of its North Korean embassy. So do you think this was an inappropriate measure taken by North Korea?
Of course I do. I think it was a terrible decision for diplomacy. And hopefully that closure is just temporary. But the North Koreans enacted very strict rules on foreigners, all foreigners in North Korea. I think they quarantined about 300 of them in total. And they had said 14 days, and then they extended it to 30 days. Let me tell you, that is an extremely harsh situation in North Korea. It's very, very difficult if you cannot leave. You have the very enclosed space that we can operate in as foreigners. But also, I think there are political reasons. I think this is a time when North Korea doesn't want foreigners in the country, not just for corona reasons, but for political reasons as well. He is using it as an opportunity to create a sense of fear of the outside world, but he's also using it as an opportunity to force the foreign presence out. And so I do think diplomatically there are going to be some consequences that are going to have far-reaching impact. We have to remember that when North Korea is allowed to carry out its nuclear testing, ballistic missile testing, without any kinds of check from the foreign presence on the ground or even internationally, that poses complications for nuclear negotiations down the road.
So at the end of last year, they said they're going to pursue a self-reliant economy against sanctions. So how do you think that coronavirus will have a negative impact?
In the short term, it's going to be very difficult for North Korea economically, but Kim Jong-un may be thinking that his strategy will help them in the long term when they sit down for negotiations with North Korea with a stronger nuclear program, because he's had this time to work on the program without any interruption. And so he's always looking at the long-term strategy rather than the short term. It means that people are going to suffer in the short term. They're going to suffer in terms of healthcare. They're going to suffer economically. And so that's always a calculation on the North Korean side.
All right, I think we got a very comprehensive coverage of the coronavirus aspect in terms of South Korea and North Korea as well. Thank you for coming in today. Thank you. That does it for today's Washington Talk. And from all of us here at Voice of America, thank you for watching. Goodbye.